Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it's great to have you with us for our weekly webinar. Now, today we're going to be talking about something which, all right, I'm pushing the envelope just a little bit. First of all, I want to give an approved absence to my friend and colleague, Mike Green, who is off traveling the country. I believe that today he's going to be in the Northeast in New England, particularly in Connecticut. But I think he's going to sneak up to Massachusetts and over to Rhode Island. So here's the thing. As you probably know, with Dr. Demographics, we don't just take a bunch of computer files and throw them at you. We actually go on the road quite often. And this is Mike's turn to travel. And, you know, I know he just loves those red eyes. They're just great fun. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about socialism, practice locations, and dentistry. Now, I'm not saying just dentistry. I'm going to talk about all different kinds of applications for this for healthcare professionals. But I want to explain a little bit where I got the topic and why I want to talk to you about it today. Socialism is making a lot of noise, and a lot of people are going, yeah, that's fantastic. Socialism is so much nicer than capitalism. It's a way for us to be a more generous, kind, giving people. Unfortunately, there are a few facts about it that are affecting where you should practice and how it's going to apply in your life. And let me explain real quickly what I mean by this. Michael Barone is one of the great political demographers of our time, and he writes the annual Almanac of American Politics. He goes through all of the congressional districts, senatorial districts, and really breaks the country up to say, where are people's political attitudes going? And also, how is that manifesting itself in how businesses and practices are being operated? In other words, there are some parts of the United States that, frankly, are being healthier, that are growing, that are doing better, and that, in fact, are going to be better for professionals like you to practice. So here's the thing. I'm trying to make the relationship between public policy and professional practice. So to do this, I want to talk to you a little bit about where you might want to consider going and where you might want to consider avoiding if it comes down to how to practice, where to practice, what to do. And let me just share my screen right here and explain a little bit what I'm talking about. Now, a lot of people don't think of it. They usually think that all political parties are nationalized and that movements are everywhere. To a degree, they are. You can find almost all opinion in the United States in one place or another, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's as strong or as pervasive everywhere. So let me explain a little bit. Ultimately, will new socialism, and this is the new face of socialism, affect your future practice site selection? Well, the obvious thing is, yeah, it should. And I actually want to tell you about where I want you to consider going so that you'll be able to be profitable and successful in your long-term investment. There are a few truths about the way that socialism is manifesting itself in the United States that I want our doctor clients to know. Now, I refer to it often as compassion fascism. This is where so many people say that we need to balance budgets on the backs of doctors. We've got to make sure that doctors are giving all of their fair share back to society. In other words, doctor, you have a target on your back. And I hate that. Now, let me tell you my perspective real quick. I own my own business. I've owned my own business for more than 30 years. I have spent years in your offices, in restaurants, coffee shops, talking to doctors about what's important to them, about their lives, about what they can do and what they should do. So in other words, I'm going to tell you, I'm on your side. I identify with you. You are, in fact, my friends. Now, that being said, I recognize that there are a lot of people out there who are not your friends. And I don't want you to be a target anymore. So let me talk about what to do about that, or how this is manifesting itself. Many politicians, these are people who are writing legislation who are affecting your life on a daily basis. They're writing checks that they cannot cash. Meaning, in other words, they don't have the public funds to be able to do the great things they want, and therefore they figure if we can only get somebody else to pay for the bill, well, then life is good and everybody's happy. Except, of course, the person who's writing the check and who's taking all the risks. Now, doctors are ultimately expected to pick up the tab in many places. Now, I say this because as I travel the country, I read papers, I do research on locations, I'm seeing that this is not something that exists everywhere. It exists, however, in some places, and in some places to a much greater degree than another. Now, you probably know that New York City has got a ban on plastic straws. And you're going, what does that have to do with me? Well, stay with me. The idea that someone can take something as innocuous as a plastic straw and say you can't use it no matter what reason you might have, well, that kind of a place is going to have a lot of risk for people who happen to have assets. Because someone else has decided, for whatever reason they have, that you should be picking up the tab on this. You should be paying for it. And I don't like that. I don't want to suggest that there aren't good reasons why public policy exists. I certainly think that regulations need to exist in some places, but in my experience, sometimes the very best places to practice, to work, to live, to spend your money are the places that you get to make your own choices. The socialist mentality means that someone else is carrying the risks, but those same people are not receiving the benefits of the risk. Now, I found this out when I was living in California and I got a huge workers' compensation bill. I thought, why am I paying so much money for my employees, but also I had to pay for myself because I was not going to turn around and sue my business. Nevertheless, someone felt like I needed to be able to put a lot of money in, and maybe you've been in that situation. Interestingly enough, at that time in California, they dramatically increased the workers' compensation bill. Now, it didn't cost the politicians a dime to be able to make sure that there was a social safety net for everybody else. Well, that's all very well and good for them, but I was struggling at the time. I wasn't doing as well. I had problems, and I wanted to hire a couple new employees, and I couldn't afford it because the regulations made it so that I couldn't do it. Does that sound familiar to you? All right, I'll get off this high horse, but I need to say a couple more things. I am fortunate enough to talk on the phone and in face-to-face conversations with hundreds of professionals a year. These doctors are people that I talk to after I visited their medical school or their dental school or their chiropractic program. I've enjoyed being with them, and I keep hearing certain things. One of those I heard just this week is I feel more and more like a cog in a wheel rather than a professional. Now, this was said by a woman who had been practicing for 20 years. She had had her own practice, and she had been told, you know, what you really need to do is to work for this big corporation, and they'll take care of all the problems. You just have to be a good professional. Except she realized they were really mistreating her. And ironically, this is somebody who has a great deal of education, clinical skill, life experience, and it appeared increasingly that because of the regulations that were placed upon her employer, it became difficult for them to let her be her and to make a good living. Now, I also hear this one. The hardest people to please are the ones who pay little or nothing. So you see, there's a big movement afoot, especially with the socialist mentality, that a doctor should put their practice right in the middle of a place where no one's paying anything. That would be the ideal place to practice, right? Because that's where the need is greatest. Well, unfortunately, that's also the place where the doctor can't make any money and yet has the greatest risk for crime. Now, have you ever known anybody, I've known several, who have an office where they were trying to be a good person and help particularly the poor and the needy. And their nitrous oxide and other drugs were stolen on a regular basis. I mean, just remarkable theft. That gets to be kind of expensive. It gets to be a problem. The staff didn't feel safe. The doctor didn't feel safe. And ultimately, they found by trying to help the people who had nothing at risk, they were putting themselves out of business. Now, next, The government seems to care about everyone else except me. Now, maybe you feel that way too. Look, I'm not trying to make a grassroots revolution here, but I am going to say these attitudes are not found everywhere, but they're certainly found in some places. And in fact, the places that I'm seeing more and more that these kinds of conversations are being had, I'm kind of recommending that doctors do not put their practices there. In short, public policies are manifestations of attitudes that exist among certain groups of people. Now, the attitudes or the things they think and believe, the values, are expressed in psychographics. This may surprise you, but we can actually track within a community the psychographic character that is dominant. In other words, where are certain attitudes to be found, and how are those attitudes manifested in public policy? It became obvious to me that there are some places that they can hardly wait to get rid of some people. It happened that there was a large law firm in San Diego, I mean, very large, big, and they handled lots of big cases. And unfortunately, the mandates on how much they had to pay people that the government had put into place made it so that they couldn't survive. Their practice model was being challenged, and they certainly couldn't do it so that they had a low fee structure. Well, they came to certain state representatives. They were very large and got the ear of some regulators and legislators and said, is there anything you can do to help us? And they said, yeah, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Have a good day. They were thrilled to get rid of that firm. Now, I might point out that firm still exists today. However, they moved their headquarters. They moved their headquarters to a place that they could more easily afford the that makes absolute sense, doesn't it? I mean, after all, you don't want to keep hitting your head against the wall. It hurts. And as Charlie Brown once said, the problem with pain hurts. So, all right, we know that this is happening. We know it's happening in some places, and I'm going to share with you in a minute where that is not happening as much. Now, here's a simple truth. And as the movement towards socialism gains momentum, oh, and I ought to point out, I believe it will, absolutely. I believe that the educational system has almost entirely failed the idea of being a small business person or a professional. I think they don't value that. But here's the thing, not every location, and I'm expressing location by states, cities, and counties, not all of them have that same mentality. So even if within a state, it may exist in large part some places, there are communities, cities, and counties within those same states that is not true. There is a major conflict. Now, even though I'm not going to recommend this as a particular state where the mentality of anti-socialism is very strong, it's certainly true in Washington state. The state is divided north and south, I mean, by mountains that go north and south, with the coastal region, which is exceptionally liberal and makes huge money, and that which is on the eastern side, which is, well, not so rich. It's much more middle class, and people do tend to struggle a little bit. There's a much more rural character to it, and this is true in many states. Illinois, for example, is not all Chicago. There are lots of parts of the state, particularly on the south, where these attitudes are not the same and where the governance does not take risky behaviors seriously. I mean, they don't want to do those kinds of things. It's hurting them. A couple of facts, though, I want to have you recognize. Profit will trump compensation rates. Now, some people say, hey, you know, the places where they have the highest compensation rates are the really big cities. Yes, I know Seattle is magnificent for its compensation rate. The same for Manhattan. It's fantastic how much you can get back. Unfortunately, it's difficult to make a profit there because the compensation rates are very often created and managed based upon overhead, or at least what the regulators consider a reasonable overhead might be. So that's why they bump up the compensation rates. But the simple truth is, you're never going to be compensated sufficiently to justify having a business that you can't afford to keep. Now, compensation rates do matter, but ultimately the return on investment matters much more. Now, I'm not going to limit this just to the cost of housing. Now, cost of living is tied most closely to the cost of housing. When the cost of housing is reasonable, the cost of living goes down. I'm not saying, that is super, super close. There are lots of other things, including the cost of employees. If there is a mandated minimum wage, you can be sure that the people who are getting that threshold, maybe it's $15 an hour, are going to make that money. But you see, other people who have certifications and experience, they're not going to settle for $15 an hour like someone else who just walks in the door. They want more than that. And so it creates a bit of an inflation in how much people are being paid. And as we track this, we see the cost of doing business, the cost per company, the cost per employee, and the cost of serving the population becomes greater and greater. And those things ratchet up step by step. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. Licenses are issued and maintained by states. So you'll see the big division between one area and another is generally manifested based upon the state regulations. If a state wants to make it particularly hard to get a license in that state, it's going to be difficult. There are some states, and we'll name Hawaii and Delaware as two good examples. It's very hard to get a license there. And now, I understand they're trying to do that as a way to maybe keep costs down, to keep competition in check. But it's the state that came up with this, and it's usually out of somebody's head, not because the market has said it. And therefore, a state can actually lower the threshold to get a license or make it more desirable to get a license or keep prices in check for lots and lots of reasons. Now, cities and counties are usually regulating the costs of doing business. It's not the state who does that. But we notice that within some states, it is much more practical to go in, and we'll talk about California for a minute. San Francisco County, Alameda County, places up in the San Joaquin is a much different place than those areas in the north. It costs a lot less to practice there. Now, granted, the state overall still will have its say, but within the state, there are reasons why you don't necessarily want to go to Cook County, Illinois. That's where Chicago is, in case you don't know. So as you're looking at the demographics of a location, you have to take into account not just the state, but the cities and the counties and the way that they're making costs higher or lower. Now, politicians increasingly have never made a payroll. Now, there was a time in which a lot of professionals, doctors, ran for public office. Even today, Congress has a few. Most of your state legislators are going to have, you have some who are doctors as well. But the majority seem to have never been in business themselves. They've never made a payroll, and they couldn't care less about how hard it is to make that nut at the end of the month. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. I have to do that. I have to make payroll, and it gets to be a stress some months. All right, well, that's just true. The problem is the lack of understanding and compassion by people who write laws and who create regulation. The problem with socialism is these people don't know. They just don't know. Maybe they're not evil people, but without knowing, whenever you're lobbying for them, it falls on deaf ears. Now, ultimately, the where of putting your practice is going to matter more and more. Now, a lot of people already in practice right now are realizing the future looks pretty dim because of some of the socialism mentality that's creeping in, particularly in the area of state regulation and the cost of doing business. So guys, I'm just going to tell you, and by the way, I mean by that guys, gals, I'm using it as a euphemism. You politically correct people. Anyway, you get the idea. Where you are practicing is going to matter. Now, ultimately, we refer to this as the low tax, low service states. There's a list of them, believe it or not, of people legislators and legislation that is created that is much more business friendly. Now, what's interesting about it, as we go through this, let's see if you can figure out some things they've got in common. Texas always seems to be number one. Low tax, but low service. Idaho, South Dakota, Florida, Louisiana, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Georgia, at least a lot of Georgia, Nevada, Indiana, Utah, Virginia, Tennessee, and sometimes West Virginia. Now, let's see if you can figure out some things these states have in common. Now, by the way, not all of them are like this, but it's a general truism. Here's the deal. They tend to be reluctant to raise taxes in all of these states. I'm not saying they don't, but I'm saying they tend to have more of a reluctance to do so, and often lots of hoops they have to jump through in the legislature to do it. But the way the state is managed and the way that these programs are administered also mattered. So let's go to the next one. Generally, the low tax, low service states include those that do not have a year-round legislation calendar. Meaning, in other words, they don't have a full-time legislature. Legislators come from outside the area. They'll come into town, sometimes for as little as a month or up to 3. And by the way, I happen to live in one of those states, which is just a crack up. Now, legislators will get together, they'll do all their communication in advance, they'll get lobbied like crazy, but even the lobbyists don't live in the state or don't work year-round to get their things across. So the lobbying efforts are going to vary. They also tend, not everyone, but tend to have what they call a strong governor model, which means that rather than be a member of the legislature, the governor kind of sits in opposition there. He's like the ruling body, or she's the person who, after the legislature has passed along what they've wanted to pass, the governor will veto it. Now, again, having seen this firsthand, I'm going to tell you it's a little funny, because the majority of legislation that goes to these governors gets rejected. The governor go, we can't afford that. And because the legislators are not in session at the time, they usually get away with it. That's what they mean by a strong governor model. There's also limited public sector union power in these states, or those states that have a very powerful, real muscly public sector union. They're the ones who create the coin-operated government. And this is a scary thing. It means, in essence, that when the public sector unions are strong, there's very little voters can do to counter them. And all kinds of programs get initiated. Everybody winds up paying all kinds of money to the government in the state, and often in the county, in the cities. Now, here's one of the aspects about those low tax, low service states. They will generally have a moderately priced housing market. In other words, they're not the places where the mega wealthy are living. It's the place that they're going to have usually lower middle class and upper middle class housing available. And often it is going to be not far one from the other. So there's not one part of the state where everybody's rich and another part where everybody's poor. What you'll find is they're a little more spread out. And this tends to make a little bit wiser choice on unfunded mandates. And I'll talk about that just right now. Unfunded mandates basically mean the government has created a program and they don't have a way to pay for it. They have, in other words, they call fiscal restraint. Now, often they have to do that because several states have legislation that says you have to balance the budget. Now, I recognize some people will blow the spending limits and they'll do something and then have to reconcile it later in conference. But ultimately, it means that when there's financial restraint, all kinds of things don't happen that typically do in those states with the nightmare scenarios. There's also an odd thing, too, that I'm going to tell you is anecdotal. These states tend to have strong school district control. In other words, when you have one of the biggest public sector expenses is school districts, when the strong school districts exist, they want to fight for their people to get money from their district, which means they're not looking for other districts to fund every program they've got. When that happens, it's just an indicator of a low tax, low service state. By the way, I hope I'm not boring you, but this could be your entire future in your practice, so stick with me. They tend to have one other tendency, and that is they welcome residential growth, and they welcome new business development. Now, there are states, by the way, and they're usually the high taxing states, that don't want new growth. They believe that everybody that's got a house, everybody's got a business, let's protect them. But when they're willing to bring in competition, you're going to notice there's a big change in the attitude of these states toward people who are in practice. Now, you want to know what these other things that these states tend to have in common? They're the ones that are growing. Within the United States, the states that are growing fastest tend to have the least regulation and the more growth happiness, in other words. They like that. So if you ask me, Scott, where should I put a practice? These are the aspects of the states that I want you to consider. Now, remember, this is not permanent. These states will come and go and change. Ohio's an interesting example. So is Tennessee. Ohio and Tennessee were not so crazy about growth and business development and new residents, but all of a sudden they kind of got religion. And their governors changed, their legislators changed. And as the state houses developed, good things tend to happen. Now, it's not a permanent thing and it can always go back. But I'm just saying these are the factors that you want to take into account. Now, let's just say we're almost out of time. So here's the deal. I want you to go to dentisiteselection.com if you're still interested in getting the a book on practice sites. I've got the veterinary book out. I've got the dentist book. And again, I'm working. Give me a little time on that book on orthodontic practice. It's very complicated on where to put an ortho practice. So I'm putting a lot of work in on it. But keep looking. Now, as for the dentalpracticeinsiders.com student report, that's /student, I want to have you understand it's not that these are discounted reports. These are really reports I created that are specifically for students. And with so many people considering where they want to buy and where they want to associate, you want to do that. Now, for $225, you can get a full demographic report and psychographic analysis and competition relationship if you're a student. And you can say, is this a good thing for me? Well, look, I understand students are poor. I was a student. I still have kids in college. Well, I know you feel my pain. Anyway, next week we're going to have a nice, interesting topic. I'll welcome back Mike Green from his trip, and I hope to have just a little bit of explanation of what's happening in the Northeast to see where's the perfect place to put a practice. And everybody, thanks so much for watching.